Welcome to Faces of South Asia, and thank you for joining us again. We have a very important guest on our show this evening, Mr. David Adams.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. Mr. David Adams is the co-director of Emerge, which is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Mr. Adams, that is Dr. Adams, is a co-founder as well as a co-director of Emerge, the first counseling program in the nation for men who abuse women, established in 1977. Dr. Adams has led groups of men who batter and conducted outreach to victims of abuse for 35 years. He has led parenting education classes for fathers for 10 years. He is one of the nation's leading experts on men who batter and has conducted trainings of social service and criminal justice professionals in 44 states and 16 nations. He has published numerous articles and book chapters, including Identifying the Assaultive Husband in Court, You Be the Judge, published in the Boston Bar Journal. Dr. Adams is a commissioner on Massachusetts Governor's Council on Sexual and Domestic Violence and past co-chair of the Justice and Accountability Committee, the Criminal Justice Committee of the Governor's Commission on Sexual and Domestic Violence. He is director of the National Danger Assessment Training Project. His book, Why Do They Kill? Men Who Murder Their Intimate Partners, was published by Vanderbilt University Press in 2007. So, Dr. Adams, what does the agency Emerge do?
Well, my agency is called Emerge, and we are located in Cambridge. But we also have a location in Roxbury, Massachusetts. But primarily what we do is that we are a counseling program for people who abuse their intimate partners. And so we have groups for mostly men. I mean, so most of the people who come to us are men who have been referred to us either by the court, or maybe the Child Welfare Department has referred them, or maybe their partners. About 35% of the men who come to us have been referred by their partners too. And so they have engaged in some sort of abusive behavior, and that really is anything from physical violence to verbal abuse to name calling, or psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and so forth. So they've engaged in some sort of behavior that has been really damaging to their partner's self-esteem. Absolutely. Because that's the way we think of it. It's really kind of any behavior that regardless of whether it's illegal behavior, it's behavior that really kind of damages another person's self-esteem or their independence. And so my agency has a 40-week program that is for men who have engaged in this behavior. We also have a parenting education program for men, and then we also do a lot of trainings for the criminal justice system and for different parts of the system to kind of help them to respond better to domestic violence situations.
So while the men, you train men, so what do you help out the women too? Like, how does it work out?
Well, and so that we do reach out to the victims, and so the men who attend our groups, it's weekly sessions for 2 hours, and then we do contact the victims over the phone, and we get their information. And we make referrals to them for services, for their own services, too. We find out, we like to talk to the women throughout the program because it really helps us to know whether he's changing or not.
Yeah.
And actually the men like the fact that we're in contact because many of the men, particularly the voluntary men, they really want to know, they want her to know that they're doing what she wants him to do, right? And, and so sometimes the women calls us first. I mean, maybe about, I'd say like 25 times a week, we get a call from a woman that wants to talk about her boyfriend or her husband. Wow. And she's desperate to get him to come to our program.
Right.
And so I will usually talk with the woman and say, well, why don't you have him call me? Because I'm going to be here for the next 4 hours, So then sometimes he does call. in the next 5 minutes he could call, or maybe it takes a year for him to call, right? But oftentimes it does start with the woman, the victim, and so if he does call, I would talk to him, and usually the man's biggest concern is that he doesn't want to be labeled as an abuser, and he'll say right off the bat, "I'm not a batterer," because he has this picture of what a batterer is like, and what I'll say is, we're not going to label you, forget about that. What we're concerned about is helping you to have better relationships, so we're focused on any kind of behavior which really is harmful to a relationship, so it doesn't have to be physical violence, it really could be just psychological abuse and so forth. So that's really what our program is, and part of what we do at the beginning is that we help the men to recognize all of the different ways that you can be damaging, to your partner's self-esteem. So that we start with a lesson that is called "What is Violence?" And so one of the things that we try to emphasize is that violence could be any way of putting another person in fear, so that you don't even have to put your hands on somebody, to make them fearful. You can, particularly if you have been violent, if you've been violent even one time, after that, all you have to do is look at her to remind her of your potential for violence, or all you would need to do is be pacing,
psychological threat.
Yeah, and then she would be fearful all over again. And so, we talk about what is violence. We also talk about what is abuse, because abuse is kind of a larger category. And so, we like to talk about all the different ways that they could be, not just harming their partner, but harming the children. Because really one of the biggest parts of parenting is how you treat the other parent, and because kids are always observing the interactions between their parents. And so, we try to get the men to think about setting a better example for their children. So,
do you find that with the kids, do they become like abusive if their fathers are abusive?
Yes, I mean that's very much the case. That the leading predictor that somebody will grow up to become an abuser is if they had a father who was abusive to the other parent, or a mother who was abusive to the other parent. So kids observe that behavior, and so they over time come to copy that type of behavior.
So that means they learn quite early in life.
They do, and it's interesting because with boys, sometimes they start out being fearful of their fathers, but then over time they come to copy their fathers because they want to kind of identify with the more powerful parent.
Absolutely, yes.
And in some cases they even will turn against the weak parent. So they see their mother as being the weak parent because she failed to protect them. And so as boys, they want to sort of identify with the male figure.
Sure. And the girls, probably the self-esteem is very low.
Yes, yeah. So, and so that's why we do a parenting program as well, because it becomes quite distressing to the men to recognize that they're really setting such a poor example. And the kids could be doing poorly in school. They could be really having certain delayed patterns, with their speech, even when they're little. They could be very anxious and so forth. So that we talk about that in the group quite a bit.
What motivated you to start all of this organization, or?
Well, I mean, I myself grew up in a violent home. So my father was violent towards my mother. And my father was also violent towards the 4 kids in the family. And so I always remember that when my father came home from work, and I grew up in Vermont, very rural, small town in Vermont, and my father worked for the granite quarries in Vermont, and so he would come home and he would sit in his car for a half hour before he came into the house.
Just outside?
Just sit in the car.
But why?
And because I think he wanted to just sort of calm himself down, or he wanted to just kind of not immediately face the demands of his family.
I see.
And so we would be staring out the windows at my father, and my mother would say, "No, don't go out there. Don't bother him. Don't bother your father." You know. And so then my father would come in the house, and he would sit for another half hour on the couch of the living room.
Right.
And again, we weren't supposed to bother him. We were supposed to leave him alone, right? And then after that, it would be dinner time, and my mother would remain standing the whole time and serve him first, and then serve the kids, you know, and it was really a very unpleasant experience, so dinner time, because my father would be yelling at us and criticizing the way that we ate,
But do you think that has to lead from the stressful life he had, stressful job?
I think it probably he learned it from his own father. You know, I think that's what I think mostly.
Times were different.
Times
also.
were different.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that my father grew up in a time when the job description for husbands was very different.
Yes.
And so that the number one part of the job description was to be a provider. And
Yes.
as long as you were being a provider, you were doing your job.
Right.
And so now we have a much different job description for fathers, you know, and for husbands. I mean, we're supposed to be caretakers now, you know.
In the Western world.
In the Western world, yes.
In the Western world.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of men are really confused about that. They're confused about what's expected of them, you know, too. Yes, and for immigrant men who come here, that is a point of confusion for them, because they feel like, well, in my country, I was a provider, I had respect, you know, and here I don't have any respect, right? And from their perspective, women have all the rights, you know, here. And they're losing their family. They feel like their family is becoming Americanized.
True.
Right.
Now, in your program, do you have the immigrants coming in?
We do,
too?
yeah.
You do.
Oh yes.
In a big number.
Oh yes. So we have language-specific groups for one thing. So we have a large Latino program, so groups in Spanish. We have a Vietnamese program. And all of our groups are very racially mixed. I mean, so that, you know, typical group, there'll be, you know, men from all different races and ethnic backgrounds.
And they're open to the idea?
Yeah, and men from who are different ages too, and so there are a lot of different generations, you know, too. We could have 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds, and we have men in their 50s and 60s.
Interesting.
Too,
Interesting.
which is really very nice, because for somebody who is 18, you know, some of the older men might say to him, you know, you're so lucky to be getting this program at your age.
Right.
Because if I had gotten this program when I was your age, I would have avoided 30 years of misery, of unhappy relationships. Yes.
It's really sad to think that a person can go through that kind of relationship. When they abuse, are they like depressive, or what brings on the violence? Like what sets them up?
Well, I mean, I think that men oftentimes translate all emotions into anger, you know.
Because they can't deal.
Right, because they don't recognize sometimes the legitimacy of other feelings, you know. So that one of the men in my group, he discovered the word anxious. He had never, and he was 42 years old, and he had never used the word anxious before. And yet he admitted he was anxious all the time, right?
Sure.
But instead of saying that he was anxious, he would get angry. You know, at his kids and his wife, and
because to show the power, maybe that's
to kind of try to control. And so I think control is also a way that a lot of men try to cope with upset and with distress. They try to control the situation. You know, this man was interesting also because he had a 14-year-old stepson, and he had 2 biological children with his wife, but every incident of abuse towards his wife would start with a fight with his stepson.
Oh, no.
Because he felt like his wife was spoiling
him.
the stepson and pandering to the stepson. So he would start to discipline the stepson, and then it would turn into a shoving situation with him, and then his wife would try to intervene, and then he would start shoving and pushing her. So before he came to our program, he had at least 30 incidents like that started just like that.
Unbelievable.
And so this man completed the program, and I took him to speak to a group of battered women and people that work for a battered women's program. He was asked, one of the women asked him, what was the turning point for you? What was the thing that really made the most difference to you? And he said he remembered in the group that he was describing another incident where he had pushed his son and ended up pushing his wife, and the youngest man in the group, who was only 18 years old, he asked him a question. He said, dude, do we even like this kid? And he was right. He was offended. He said, like, what kind of question is that? Of course I like him. He's my stepson. And then the other kid said, but does he know that you like him? Because if he doesn't know, then it doesn't count. Right?
That's true.
And so then the 18-year-old talked about how he had a stepfather, and he never felt like his stepfather liked him. And so he always made it a point to give him a hard time,
Interesting.
the rest of his life. And so that was a very helpful thing, because then we focused on the need for him to really develop more of a relationship with his stepson, to become his buddy. And to really kind of back off of trying to discipline him, to let his wife handle that, And so that's what he did. He just started focusing on having a stronger relationship and taking him, to sporting events and taking him on walks. And it really changed everything. It changed his relationship with his stepson. It changed his relationship with his wife. And it just was a huge starting point. But it started with an 18-year-old helping a 42-year-old. Right?
Wow. That's amazing. That really is.
But the program helps. The program works.
Definitely.
Yeah.
What are the other abuses that you have come across during your years? The men, normally. I know you have a book here that say, why do they kill? Men who murder.
Yeah, I mean, those are the most extreme cases, and so those are very rare. I mean, most of the men that we see in our program are men who haven't been that extreme in their behavior, but although it varies. I mean, sometimes people have been physically
abusive,
quite violent. Some men have not been violent at all, but psychologically abusive too. And so
what do they do, like psychologically? What do they do that, why is the anger coming up? Is it because men can't articulate or cannot talk about it or don't explain themselves, and that's why they have this trouble?
Well, I think that the most common psychological characteristic of most abusers is their self-centeredness. I don't think it's anger, per se.
Right.
I think it really, so that I think that, and some of the men are even what I would call to be narcissistic in their orientation. And I think that kind of one aspect of narcissism is, or one aspect of, and I don't want to say always it's narcissistic because it's an extreme, but most of them are very self-centered, is to kind of feel that they are giving more than they really are giving. And so to inflate the significance of what
themselves?
You're giving to other people. So they feel that they're giving, and because their most common complaint to their wives is that she never appreciates all that I do for her.
Well,
right?
I'm way too good.
Right. And so they have this sort of exaggerated sense of all that they're doing because they're self-centered, which is very different from non-abusive husbands. I did a study that compared abusive husbands to non-abusive husbands. And it was interesting because one of the things I asked the men was, how much of the housework do you do? And how much of the child care do you do?
Right.
And I interviewed both abusive husbands and non-abusive husbands, and I interviewed their wives separately.
Right.
And I expected to find that the abusive husbands would do less of the housework and less of the child care.
Right.
But I was wrong. They
Oh,
both
really?
did. Both sets of husbands did the same amount of housework, which was it was 21%.
Unbelievable.
And the way that I arrived at that was that I'd asked the husbands, what percentage of the housework do you do?
Mm-hmm.
And most husbands would say 50%.
Right.
And then I'd ask the wives, and the wives would say maybe 5%, maybe 7%. But it averaged out to be 21% for both sets of husbands, right?
Wow.
But here is where the non-abusive husbands were different. They knew they were getting a good deal. They would say, I'm very lucky because my wife does a lot, and they recognized that their wives were doing double shifts.
So the
Right.
main word is recognize.
They recognized.
Nice.
And so the wives, their wives knew that they were doing more, but they weren't bothered by it because at least he recognizes and he appreciates
Appreciates.
all the
Lovely.
things that she's doing. But the abusive husbands, they didn't do that. They didn't.
They didn't see
said,
that.
she never appreciates what I'm doing. I do more than most men, but she never
Never
appreciates that.
Yeah.
And so they were comparing themselves to their fathers, who maybe
Oh.
only did 5%, and therefore, because they do 20%, they think they should be endlessly appreciated.
Oh.
And then they get into this victim mentality. They think, well, see, she never appreciates me. She's never happy. The other really common complaint that a lot of abusive men have is that she's never happy. She's never happy. And part of what we're trying to do is help them to see that the very things you complain about are the direct result of your own behavior. So that we have this exercise called, what is the effects of abusive behavior? And so we make a list, so that she may become depressed, she may become angry, she may become distrustful, she may talk behind your back, she may turn to other people for support, she may be ambivalent about the relationship. And so, interestingly, the men have noticed all of those things about their wives, but they've never connected it to their abusive behavior. They think, see what I am dealing with? She's always talking behind my back.
Always on the phone.
She's never happy. She never appreciates. So that we're saying, think about this. Think about why that is. What you're complaining about are normal responses, to being abused. And so that if you really want good things. You want respect. You want love. You want appreciation. You
Right.
want her to be happy. And so you have to give the things that you want. If you want respect, you need to give respect.
Sure.
Right? And so that's what we do. And it's a kind of a slow process to teach somebody empathy.
Right.
But it's very much like a muscle that improves with use, and so that if you rarely sort of give empathy, you have a very weak
Right.
empathy.
Such a lovely way
It
of
is, it is. It's
relating. Love it.
excellent.
Yes.
And so that we try to get, and really the most, I think, best manifestation of empathy is listening. And so one of the things that we teach in our program is the value of listening. And so we ask the men to please focus on that. Please focus on the next time you're having a discussion with your wife, try to listen to her, and try to really understand what she is saying. And so then report back to us. Tell us, we'd like to know, every week how you're progressing in that regard.
But do they say to you, like, oh, she just chats?
Yes, at the beginning. So at the beginning, many of the men are complaining about their wives because they think of themselves as victims.
Sure.
Right? And so they don't really kind of recognize yet that
See,
they're
I
the
find-
source of their own problems, right? And so we're trying to change that dynamic. We're trying to give them tools they can use to create a different dynamic. So that one of the wives that I talked with just the other night, she said, I was so surprised. The other day, he said, you look tired. And that is the first time he's ever made any kind of reference to my feelings.
Oh my God.
He looked in my eyes and he said, "You look tired." And so she, she was shocked that he was noticing her feelings, and because he'd never done that before. And so that was really the beginning of some change for him, because then he really started noticing that she actually feels closer to me,
Right. True.
when I show concern for her feelings, and then we kind of talked with him about, what do you think is on your wife's mind, this week? And he mentioned that her mother was sick. And so we had the men, what is something he could say to his wife that would show her that he cares about what's on her mind? And somebody else said he could ask her about her mother.
Yes.
And so the next week, it's his turn to kind of give his report about the past week. And he doesn't mention that. He doesn't mention whether he asked her. And so we have this part of our program where the person sitting to the right asks that person a question. And so the person who was sitting to his right asked him, "Did you ask about her mother?"
Wonderful.
And so the men follow up with each other, too. And so then he did it the next week, and his wife appreciated that he was asking about her mother.
So do you?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Do
No.
you do it in a group then? Is
Yes,
that
so
what-
it's a group.
Oh, it's a group.
Yeah,
It
and
helps.
so the
Helps,
men
yeah.
are asked to please help each other to develop empathy and to develop respect. So it's easier to see somebody else's problem than your own problem.
Yeah,
True.
that's
Right?
true. That's so true.
And so, so you can be really helpful to somebody else, by helping them to develop empathy. So when he's talking about his situation with his wife, we want you to help him to try to understand what the wife's feelings might have been.
True.
And so that's how you can help him. And you'll be learning something yourself by doing that, because you'll be practicing
Right.
empathy.
Right. Would you say, like, teaching teenagers would be very important about people's feelings?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so that, yes, I mean, I think that there are prevention programs that really talk about relationships,
Right.
and I think with teenage relationships, unfortunately, there's a lot of things that kids are impressed by
Yes.
that they shouldn't be impressed by.
Right.
So that, a girl may be impressed by his jealousy
Yes.
because it's a sign that he cares
Cares.
about me, right?
Right.
When really it's a sign of possession,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so, we talk to girls about that, like, don't be impressed by that, because that's really, that's a sign of possessiveness. And we say to boys, if you want to have good relationships,
Right.
you have to let her have her own space, You can't always try to force her to make a decision, to spend time with you or spend time with other people. She shouldn't have to choose between you and her friends. And so that in these dating programs, we do talk about what are the early warning signs that you may be dating somebody who's abusive.
Right.
And, so that, for instance, if he always makes you feel like you have to choose, if he's isolating you, basically, if he makes you feel guilty about time that you spend with your friends or your relatives, that's a sign. If he shows signs of possessiveness, that's also a sign. If he's trying to sort of rush the relationship, if he's trying to sort of get you to have sex too fast, to make a commitment too fast, and always making you feel guilty because, I love you, why don't you love me in the same way, right? And really, it's normal for kids to not want to rush into a committed relationship at the beginning.
Right.
That's really healthy. And so sometimes a girl might be impressed if there's a boy who wants to have a relationship, right? That's a
Right.
sign of maturity.
Absolutely.
But really, it could be a sign of control, right? And isolation, too. So that would be another sign. I think another sign is if he doesn't really kind of talk about his past relationships. Maybe he's had problems in his past relationship, or he always refers to his ex-partner in negative terms.
Right.
It makes her feel like, well, you're nothing like her.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
terrible.
You know,
That's
you're
awful.
nothing like her. You know, he makes her feel special.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And is always critical of his ex-partner. That's a warning sign also. You know.
I credit the men who come to your program. It's not easy.
Yeah.
Or recognizing that they have this issue. It's not easy.
Well, I mean, for some of them, they have, you know, they're required to come. But I think that what you said is true because ultimately they have to choose to get something out of the program.
Absolutely.
You know, too, so that, you know, that's up to them. I always say the court can order you to come to the program, but they
Right.
can't order you to get anything out of the program. That's up to you.
So it's like a 9-month course, actually.
It is, yeah,
It's like
yeah.
a whole 9 months that you...
Right.
I guess it takes a long time
It
to
does.
retrain yourself, basically.
It does. It is. I think retraining is a
Retraining's-
good word because I think the men have had very little guidance. I think boys don't get a lot of guidance about
Right.
relationships.
True. Right.
Boys are taught to think about their careers and their work,
Yes.
so that they don't really have the same practice that girls have. I think.
To be fair, I mean, I knew about Dove, I knew about women issues. Honestly, I had no idea that there was men who were also in the same. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So it's so important to have you in this program.
Well, right, and why should the burden of change always be on the victim? I
True.
mean, why should she be the one who has to uproot her
Right.
lives and her children's lives?
Right.
100% of domestic violence is caused by abusers.
yes.
Right?
Yes.
Well, I
You know,
never
and so
knew,
we
like...
should expect the abusers to take
Oh,
responsibility.
definitely,
you know?
definitely. I mean, I really never thought like they think that they're the victims. Like, it really never occurred to me
Right.
that they would really think that they're victims
Yes.
when they are doing the harm, the most harm
That's right.
to their partners,
That's right.
basically.
But on
And-
the other hand, do you see that the men really want to change too? It's not that some may do it consciously.
They're not getting what
Yes.
they want.
Yes.
They're unhappy, but they blame
can't.
her, and they're not sort of recognizing how they're creating their own problem.
So they can't express themselves? Is that what it's basically?
Well, no, I think it's because they're self-centered sometimes, and they're focused on her behavior and not
Right.
their own behavior,
Behavior.
too. So they're trying to control how she responds. They blame her for being unhappy. You're never happy. There's no pleasing you.
True. Yes, absolutely.
Instead of recognizing the things that they can do, to
Right.
create a different outcome in the relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
Have the men mentioned that the women are demanding? It's just a question because I represent the woman.
Yes.
I don't know the men too
Yeah.
well, other than my husband or my father or my brother. But I sometimes think women are demanding and they push their men to the edge.
Well, I think that it is actually kind of more common. When I did my study that compared abusive husbands to non-abusive husbands, in the average non-abusive relationship, the wife usually had more, would be the decision maker a lot of the times.
Yes.
And she would be the one who would take the initiative with a
Right.
lot of things, particularly things in the house and with the children.
Yes.
And to the credit of the husbands, they recognized and appreciated their wives.
Right.
She would, and the wives are actually more likely to become emotional, even to express anger and upset. But again, the husbands would not have a problem with that. They would sort of see it as their responsibility to help her.
In a partnership way.
Yes, I mean, so that, rather than seeing the wife as being bossy, they might sort of choose to see her as being anxious because she has higher standards about, in my, relationship, my wife has higher standards about the way things should look in the house.
Sure.
So if we have company coming, she will ask me, how do you think the house looks? And I will say, I think it looks fine. But no, it doesn't look fine because she has higher standards than I do.
Right.
And so rather than getting upset about that, my solution is to pitch in to help her feel less anxious by,
Right.
fixing up the house, right?
Cooking or
Right.
what? Oh, okay.
So usually wives are the social secretaries, too,
Sure.
and
Oh,
so, I think I think most men who are non-abusive will appreciate that they're benefiting from that arrangement. Right?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely.
And whereas an abusive husband would sort of see that as being bossy. Or controlling. Right?
Manipulative.
Or manipulative. Right?
Yes. What an interesting.
Yes. Quite interesting that I never really saw the men's point, what they're thinking and why they're abusing, and why women are getting abused.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there's the biggest myth probably about abusers is that they're easy to spot. I think that most people think that you would know an abuser when you spotted one. But it turns out that that's true in only about a quarter. Only about a quarter of abusers are easy to identify because they are angry towards everybody.
Yes.
Right,
Okay.
and they get in trouble, with their bosses, or they get into road rage incidents. And it turns out that there's just enough of them that everybody keeps looking for that type of person.
And then
But in reality, it's not.
But in reality, 3/4 of the men are extremely likable, are very friendly to they actually, many of them are more likable than their wives are.
Really?
Because they have social skills. I mean, their neighbors like them. And domestic violence affects victims more than it affects perpetrators.
Yes.
Right.
And so people see her as being upset and unhappy,
Right.
and isolated maybe, or distant or withdrawn, and they see him as being very friendly and outgoing, and even in homicide cases, what is the thing that the neighbors say about the killer?
He's
He's
such
very
a
nice.
Yes,
That's
you're right.
true. Oh my
I
God.
cannot believe this.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
my
even
God.
in those cases, right? Yeah.
So he's always a nice guy, but
That's right.
but there's a lot more to that. If the woman's like really quiet or
Yeah.
something, would you pick that up though? If a woman's
Yes.
like really
Yes,
like
that would be a warning sign to me, right? But I think, and if you're a parent of a teenager, that would be a
Right.
warning sign that maybe your daughter, is in an abusive relationship if she becomes very withdrawn all of a sudden.
Okay.
But I think a lot of people, they have misunderstanding. They judge people according to how they come across to them, and so you have the abuser who is very likable.
right?
Right.
Oh wow.
Very friendly. He offers to mow people's lawns, and they see her as being very isolated, and they think, well, I don't think he's an abuser.
Something is
I don't
wrong.
think that's possible, right?
And she's too quiet, and maybe she's not the nice person, and he's the nicer person. Oh my
And
God.
something is wrong with her. That's the
Wow.
first thing people guess.
So
So in high schools, very often the abusive boyfriend is the most popular kid, or the athlete, or
the jocks.
yeah. I mean, or it doesn't even have to be a jock. It could be like student government, or
I see.
But again, I think kids kind of gravitate towards popular, kids,
Kids.
and so sometimes they judge victims,
Because he has
harshly.
the social skill.
Right.
He is narcissistic. He's egoistic. He's self-centered.
Right.
And he knows how to sell himself.
Right,
So,
that's right.
as a teenager.
Is that
Yes.
basically on looks, you think, or because he's gotten to that position? Is that what it all stems down to?
Well, I think the problem is that narcissism does not in any way impede success.
Okay.
Many of the most successful people in all fields are narcissistic.
Right.
True.
Right.
And so they have skills that enable them to be successful.
Right.
And so for many people, they kind of like the very things that enable them to be successful are the very things that are toxic to a relationship, right? And so they want to be, what is your problem? Why can't you appreciate me the way everybody else appreciates me?
Because
Right.
I'm so successful, or I
Right.
do such a good job.
That's right.
It's like the sword. It cuts both
Both
sides.
sides, yeah.
It's a fine line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I still don't understand that why do they kill?
Why do they kill?
When you love someone that much, why do they kill?
Well, I mean, what I found when I researched, and so I conducted a study of 31 men, who are all prisoners, who killed their wives or girlfriends. And I did 5-hour interviews with each killer. And I found that
What was their background, if you don't mind me interrupting?
their background was very varied. so that they have different races, different class backgrounds, successful men who are unemployed, so all over. But I found that there were really 5 types of killers in terms of their motivation to kill. And the most common type of killer by far was possessively jealous. And so they kill their wives when their wives seek to end the relationship. But even prior to that, they have a history of being toxically jealous towards their wives. Not just towards the woman they killed, but all previous partners. They exhibited this extreme possessive, jealous behavior. And so that over time, they become ever more convinced of their suspicions, because one way that a victim reacts to jealousy is to seek separation
Yes.
and to seek solace from other people.
Right.
And so that convinces him that it must be true,
And
that
it's
he's-
not.
Right. And so they over time become more and more jealous. They devote more and more time to surveilling her. When there's a separation, some of the men actually quit their jobs or were fired from their jobs in order to have time to spy
my
on her.
I cannot believe this.
Oh, this is like also on your phone. People have
Oh, cell phone, yeah.
cell phones, because I've heard like people say to me like, oh, he knew where I was, so
Right.
that's
Yeah,
sort of
calling
scary.
up, frequently calling her to find out where she is.
What helps them? Like, what do you do to help these men?
Well, with jealousy, I think that that's a very clear problem, and so we say this is really kind of becoming a real barrier to intimacy. When you try to smother somebody, they seek separation.
Yeah.
And so a normal, healthy relationship should have boundaries. One of the interesting things that we do in our program is that we do a relationship history. And so we ask each man to talk about each relationship he has had with an intimate partner. How did the relationship begin? What were his attractions? When did you first start having sex? What were her biggest complaints about you? And so forth. And it's interesting because very often with abusive men, there's a very short courtship.
Oh, okay.
And so they rush into relationships. And a lot of times they think they're rescuing a woman. So very often, one of the questions is, how did you meet? And it's very common for them to say things like, well, her car was disabled, and I came along and I fixed her car. Or I met her at an AA meeting, and she was really upset because of her ex. She was on the rebound from a bad relationship, and I cheered her up. So that's another type of rescuing,
Okay.
right? And so these men see themselves as rescuers of women in distress.
The knight in shining armor.
That's right.
Yes, exactly.
and so they feel needed. They feel, but the other side to that is that there's no privacy. There's no
Boundaries.
No boundaries, and it's very hard to create boundaries after the fact.
Right.
If you haven't done it when you're dating, it becomes very threatening, for her to seek set any kind of boundaries. One of the men in the group, he would have an argument with his wife, and then he would get so upset. He would be so fearful that she might try to leave him that he wouldn't go to work the next day. He would get in the shower with her, and so he would smother her, right?
Can you believe?
Yeah.
He's insecure.
So yeah, it's insecurity, but
Mostly controlling.
and it's controlling. That's right. Right. And so we say, a healthy relationship, you should have privacy. You should have times when you have other friends. You should have other friends. She should have other friends.
Yes.
That doesn't take away from your relationship. That actually adds to your relationship.
Right. Definitely.
And so that is one common problem. And like I said, the most common type of killer is an extremely jealous type of killer.
Right.
There's also murder-suicides, which is 30% of all intimate partner homicides are ones where the killer kills himself. And so that type of person also tends to be extremely jealous. And so the only additional factor for that type of person is that there's also depression. you know,
Right.
and usually mental illness of some kind, which creates a lot of stigma in the family. A lot of times the victim is constantly trying to get him back into treatment or
Right.
back on his medications.
Right.
And they become more isolated over time and more
Right.
desperate over time,
Right.
too. There's also another type of jealous person who's a substance abuser, and that type of person has even faster relationships than the other types of killers. The average courtship for that type of abuser is 1 month.
Unbelievable.
So 1 month from the time that they meet to the time they start living with their is the average. So that they oftentimes their life revolves around drinking or using drugs, and they oftentimes try to induct her into their lifestyle, which then kind of she loses a lot of status. And if she complains about the relationship, he will tell her, I will report you to the child welfare system.
Oh my
for
God,
using
are you using-
alcohol or drugs. And so they have this blackmail they can always use.
Right.
After that. So that, but it all starts with their, life revolving around drinking and drugging, and having this real dependency on her to take care of him, so to speak. So then there's another type of killer that I call materially motivated, which is not a jealous type. This type of man is obsessed with money
Okay.
and status. He's not upset about losing his wife. He's upset about losing the assets of the marriage. And so it's cheaper to kill her than to divorce her.
True.
Oh.
And he's also concerned about his image in the community of being a successfully married man. And a lot of what actually triggers them to kill is that they have secret lives. And
What do you mean by secret
they
lives?
have mistresses.
Okay.
They have things, and quite a number of the killings in Massachusetts reflect this. I mean, there was the Neil
doctor.
Entwistle, who was the British national, who killed his wife and the daughter
Yes.
in their bed. His wife had just discovered that he was helping people set up pornographic websites, even though he was an engineer. And also that they didn't have money on his charge card, when she tried to buy furniture for the new home. So that very often the discovery of the secrets is what triggers these men to kill, because they're seeking to preserve their secrets and their reputation.
Their identity.
Yeah, the lifestyle.
She discovers that he doesn't have a college degree. She discovers that his life is a lie, basically.
Right.
So.
Divorce can be expensive. That
Divorce,
could be
yeah.
another reason.
Right.
Yeah.
You have a business. Some of the killers had businesses with their wives, and they felt that they'd been, deprived of their fair share of the business.
Right.
Too. So that also becomes a motivation.
How many examples we have, and just if you look at society has to be educated. I know your Emerge is doing a great job, but I still think society has to be educated, because the examples you gave, was eye-opener to me, and
Oh,
I'm sure to
definitely.
you too.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we're very status. It's very troubling to me to think about self-centeredness and how that seems to be even more of a growing problem for young people. I think that the social media
Right.
really drives that. I think that there's more concern about image now
Likes,
than,
yes.
than one's character. And so kids are spending more and more time devoting themselves to their preferred image.
You're right, the portfolio.
And how many friends
likes.
they have.
Yes.
There's evidence that they give tests of narcissism to college students every year.
Oh, really?
And the scores keep getting higher, too, for college students. So they become more and more concerned about their image.
Right, right.
And amazingly, it's the girls and the boys.
Yes.
In this case, it's not just the men,
That's
or
right.
just it's the both.
Right.
So society is changing.
It is. It's
yeah.
completely changing, and I think maybe a lot of men have a hard time adjusting to that,
Yes.
the change,
Right.
because they're no longer, the number one person in like a girl's life, kind of, like, because she's now has her own career or wants to do a lot more
That's right.
than what a guy does. And
What I like is the Western world has the support. Massachusetts, all the states have a lot of support, a lot of programs. I'm concerned about the immigrants that are coming into this country, getting their permanent residency. They're raising their children. They kind of belong to the other country. And the children are clashing with the parents,
That's right.
perhaps, because they like the American freedom, which I strongly believe.
Right.
Whether it's a girl or it's a boy, so they want to be independent. They want to reach their goals in life. The
Right.
parents put boundaries. When it comes to age, they want them to marry. So it's like a clash. So it's very important to reach out to all these so-called immigrants who are permanent residents.
I think that's true, what you said. I think oftentimes it is the kids who call the police,
Yes.
too, because they are more Americanized, as you said, and oftentimes the father is very threatened by that. He feels like the kids are betraying the culture, and the wife is somehow betraying the culture, too, and so that we try to educate the men in our Vietnamese program and our Spanish program also that you should really, be proud of having American kids.
Yes.
Kids who kind of aspire to independence.
right.
You want them to be successful, right?
Yes.
And this is really part of their success is for them to be independent-minded,
Right,
And so congratulations, for having,
But I guess they feel like they don't have any control, and that
That's right.
might be
That's
what
right.
it is.
And so we're really helping them to see it in a different way.
Which is great.
Yeah.
But the term Americanized, which you used, actually taken in the global market, sometimes it's media
Negative.
shows that it's negative.
That's right.
Yes.
Being Americanized does not mean the bad Americanized or the bad. Every society all over the world has its good, has its bad.
That's right.
But the main thing that I think is it recognizes who you are, it respects who you are. That's what America does. As well as it respects who you are, and you have the freedom to choose. There was something on CNN yesterday, and they said, why do you want to work for someone? And he was a venture capitalist. So he said, I do not want to work for anybody. I want to work for myself because for the freedom. So freedom is not related just to culture or tradition. It's freedom is I want to work for myself because I want to have my own time.
That's
individual
right.
freedom.
Right.
Which in the global view, you can say Americanized, and people say, oh, that's really bad. That's that kind of music, or that's breaking from society. So it's so important for all the immigrant population, and it really stress on the immigrant population because they are flooding into the country. And while we are trying to survive, the immigrant population is coming, and we are having a clash. Is how do we educate these dads, these moms also?
Right. But I think that immigrants are really the best Americans. I think that they actually represent the American spirit more than acclimated Americans do, because they kind of like they have this sense of wanting to prove themselves, of kind of like wanting to succeed, a sense of community. I think they are the best Americans, immigrants.
True, Dr. Adams, but there are schools in inner cities that perhaps they are the children coming from those homes have broken homes, have poverty.
Yes.
So my emphasis is to those children, those population in all the states of United States where they are in the inner city, not the affluent or not the well-to-do, to reach out to the public school program to educate them that what you saw last night in your residence is not what we accept. And it's not right.
That's right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that obviously, there's some excesses to being American. I think this whole extreme emphasis on individual freedom.
Yes, Yes.
at the expense of everything
Of
else.
else.
You know, and so that's a part of copying America that I don't like. You know, that
Yes.
other cultures are copying that sort of sense of this extreme notion of individuality at the expense of everything else.
Which
I
is
like it because I like to speak it from immigrant point of view because I came to this country
Yeah.
and I've learned a lot and I love the country and I love it, but I know what are the errors that the immigrants who are coming in and
Yeah.
what they can do and what they are doing, what that's not right, how
Yes.
to teach them. And I mainly believe the children are the key to the future. They need to be educated and they need to be shown that this is the goodness is when you treat women or men equally and with respect.
Right.
You will have a better social circle. You will have, harmony.
Yes. We have a very good exercise in our parenting program that's called Teaching Respect. And the way that we do it is that we ask the men what values do they believe in teaching their children. And almost always the first thing they say is respect.
yes, definitely.
And so then we ask, well, how is respect learned by children? Is it learned from words or from behavior? And they will say, well, it probably is learned from behavior. And so then, okay, so what are the things that kids are observing between their parents? All these invisible little interactions, nonverbal as well as verbal. So, and so we kind of have this list of 7 indicators of respect. And the first one is listening. So how often do your kids see you listening to their mother?
True.
Which is a sign of respect.
Right.
Give yourself a 2 if it's a lot. Give yourself a 1 if it's just sometimes. And give yourself a 0 if it's hardly
Ever.
at all. And so asking questions is a sign of respect.
True.
Recognizing boundaries is a sign of respect.
True.
And so we have a scorecard, and the men then give themselves scores, and the men are upset, though, because they have low scores. At the beginning of the exercise, if we asked them, how well do you think you're teaching respect to your kids? They will say, oh, I'm very good.
Excellent.
I'm very good on that.
I'm very
you
good
know.
on that, yeah.
But then after the exercise, I realize I'm letting my kids down. I'm not really doing a good job. I'm not setting a good example.
So do you do this at the beginning of your time with them and then at the end of your course,
Yeah.
at the 9 months, and see how they've
Oh,
changed?
you see, people that observe our groups notice that, too. They notice that.
So how many are there in your
differences.
group? Like how many?
12 usually.
Oh,
yeah.
really?
Yeah.
At a time, you
Yes,
do
at a
12
time,
people.
yeah.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I would really appreciate you coming on the show and showing us all the different.
Well, I love talking about it, and I think it's so unusual for men to have the opportunity to talk about relationships
Yes.
with other men, and so I like that aspect of our
Interact,
program,
yeah.
that men have these conversations that they wouldn't otherwise
Normally
have.
do,
Right.
yes.
So.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. We brought you a completely different new aspect. I hope you enjoyed our show this evening. See you again next time. This is Esha from Faces of South Asia. Dr. Adams, thank you.
And Sophie, thank you very much for watching our show.